Like a January night in 1837, Amelia Whittaker sat in a chair in the corner of a locked room at Oakridge Plantation, a pen trembling in her hand and a blank ledger page before her. Her husband stood across from her, his gray eyes cold as winter steel, and gave her explicit instructions about what she was to observe and record. The woman brought into that room was named Lila. She was 23 years old, terrified, and had no choice in what was about to happen. Neither did Amelia. What began that night would continue for years, turning a Louisiana plantation into something far darker than the usual horrors of slavery. It would involve a doctor from New Orleans with twisted theories about human breeding, a network of wealthy men trading children like livestock, and a secret that would eventually consume everyone. Before we continue with the story of Amelia Whittaker and the nightmare that unfolded at Oakridge, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. We love hearing from our community across America. What Amelia witnessed that night was only the beginning of something far more calculated and horrifying than she could have imagined. Baton Rouge served as Louisiana's capital from 1849, but in the 1830s it was a growing hub of politics and commerce, a city of muddy streets and grand mansions where politicians and plantation owners mingled in parlors thick with cigar smoke and schemes. 20 miles northeast, where the Amite River carved through cypress swamps and bottomland, Oakridge Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of sugarcane field. The main house, built in the Greek Revival style with its symmetrical facade and tall columns, stood on a slight rise, positioned so that Theodore Whittaker could survey his entire domain from the second-floor veranda. Theodore had inherited Oakridge from his father in 1832 at age 28, along with 37 enslaved people and a reputation for cold efficiency. He stood just under 6 feet, lean and angular, with pale gray eyes that people said looked through you rather than at you. His hands were always clean, nails trimmed short, a stark contrast to the dirt-creased fingers of other planters who still worked alongside their field hands in those early years. Theodore never touched a hoe. He studied ledgers, read agricultural journals from New Orleans and Mobile, and corresponded with men who spoke of scientific farming and rational management of resources, both plant and human. Amelia Caldwell became Amelia Whittaker in May 1834. She was 19, he was 30, and the marriage united two prominent southern Louisiana families. Her father owned a successful mercantile business in Baton Rouge, supplying everything from fabric to farm equipment to the surrounding plantations. Amelia had been educated at a finishing school in Natchez, unusual for the time, and could read Latin, play pianoforte, and manage household accounts with precision. She had auburn hair that she wore in the fashionable style of the era, pulled back severely from a face that portraits show was handsome rather than beautiful, with a strong jaw and intelligent dark eyes. Their first year passed pleasantly enough by the standards of planter society. Amelia managed the household servants, organized dinners for Theodore's political connections, and learned the rhythms of plantation life. The house smelled of beeswax and jasmine in summer, wood smoke and cinnamon in winter. She kept a garden of medicinal herbs, as most plantation mistresses did, learning which plants soothed fever and which eased the pains of childbirth for the enslaved women who had no access to proper doctors. But by their second anniversary, the absence of children had become a source of tension in a society that measured a woman's worth by her ability to produce heirs, Amelia's failure to conceive was whispered about at church socials and ladies' teas. Theodore said nothing directly, but Amelia noticed the way his jaw tightened when friends mentioned their growing families, the way he would leave the room when someone asked when they might hear the patter of little feet at Oakridge. In September 1836, Theodore brought a doctor from Natchez to examine Amelia. The man spent 3 days at the plantation, conducting examinations that Amelia later described in her diary as humiliating beyond measure. His conclusion, delivered to Theodore in the study while Amelia waited in the parlor, was definitive. Some defect in her womb made conception impossible. The doctor used technical terms Amelia did not understand, but the message was clear. She would never bear children. Theodore's response was not anger, which Amelia might have expected. Instead, he became eerily calm. He thanked the doctor, paid him generously, and sent him back to Natchez. That night at dinner, he told Amelia that he had been doing a great deal of reading. He had corresponded with men in New Orleans who were studying what they called natural philosophy, the science of heredity and breeding. Like a 55-year-old Southern American historian or preacher telling a dark secret from the past. If Amelia could not give him an heir through natural means, he would pursue alternative methods. Methods that were, he assured her, perfectly legal under Louisiana law and widely practiced, if not widely discussed, throughout the South. Amelia understood immediately what he meant. The practice was indeed common, though rarely acknowledged openly. Planters who wanted to increase their labor force without the expense of purchasing more slaves would father children through enslaved women. These children, inheriting their mother's status regardless of their father's race, would themselves become property. Some planters kept these arrangements discreet. Others were blatant about it. But what Theodore proposed went far beyond the usual exploitation. He wanted her involved. He wanted her present. He wanted her to document everything. The first woman Theodore selected was named Lila, 23 years old, tall and strong from years of field work. On a cold January night in 1837, Theodore had Lila brought to a room on the east side of the main house, a room that had once been used for storing linens, but which he had converted for this purpose. He ordered Amelia to be present, to observe, to take notes on Lila's physical characteristics, her health, her demeanor. Amelia's diary entry from that night was brief, the handwriting shaky. "God forgive me. I did as he commanded. I sat in the corner with pen and paper while my husband destroyed what remained of my dignity and Lila's humanity. She did not cry out. I think that was the worst part, the silence." But Theodore's plan was even more elaborate than Amelia initially realized. Over the following weeks, she discovered that he had been reading extensively about the theories of selective breeding being discussed in agricultural journals and medical societies. These theories, which would later be recognized as the pseudoscientific racism that underpinned slavery's most horrific aspects, suggested that human beings could be improved through careful selection of breeding pairs, just as one might breed horses or cattle for desirable traits. Theodore had decided to conduct an experiment. Spring of 1837 brought unseasonable warmth to East Feliciana Parish. The magnolias bloomed early, filling the woods around Oakridge with white blossoms that fell like snow in the slightest breeze. Amelia walked among them one morning in late March, crushing petals beneath her boots, trying to find some fragment of peace in the natural world, because there was none to be found within the walls of her home. Lila was pregnant. Amelia had confirmed it herself, recognizing the signs she had once hoped to see in her own body. Theodore received the news with satisfaction, making a notation in the leather-bound book he had begun keeping, a ledger separate from the normal plantation records. Amelia glimpsed it once when he left it on his desk. The pages were ruled into columns with headings that made her stomach turn: physical characteristics, estimated intelligence, projected value, disposition, breeding potential. But Lila was only the first. In April, Theodore selected another woman, Clara, who was just 19. Then in May, a woman named Eliza, who worked in the kitchen. Amelia was required to be present each time, to observe and record. She developed a system of dissociation, a way of separating her mind from what her eyes witnessed. She would focus on irrelevant details: a crack in the plaster wall, the sound of night insects outside the window, the smell of lamp oil burning low, anything but the horror unfolding before her. The other enslaved people at Oakridge knew what was happening, of course. How could they not? The women who were selected moved through their daily work with hollowed eyes. The men who were husbands or brothers or friends could do nothing, their rage forced into silence by the ever-present threat of violence or sale. The plantation's atmosphere changed. Where there had been the usual rhythms of forced labor and coerced cooperation, now there was something darker, a tension that hummed beneath every interaction. And then, in July, a visitor arrived who would transform Theodore's private obsession into something far more systematic. Dr. Elias Beaumont came to Oakridge on a Thursday afternoon, his carriage rattling up the cypress-lined drive, trailing red dust. He was affiliated with the Medical Society of Louisiana in New Orleans, though Amelia later learned his credentials were murky at best. Beaumont was in his 50s, portly, with mutton-chop whiskers and soft hands that had probably never delivered a difficult birth or set a broken bone. His specialty, he explained over dinner that first evening, was what he called anthropological medicine, the study of racial characteristics and their transmission through bloodlines. Theodore had been corresponding with Beaumont for months, ever since reading one of the doctor's papers in a New Orleans medical journal. The paper, titled Observations on the Hereditary Transmission of Physical and Mental Characteristics in the Negro Race, proposed that through careful documentation and selection, planters could cultivate more valuable enslaved populations. It was pseudoscience of the vilest sort, but it was taken seriously in certain circles, published in respectable journals, discussed in the parlors of educated men who believed they were advancing human knowledge. Beaumont stayed at Oakridge for 3 weeks that summer. He examined every enslaved person on the plantation, measuring skulls with brass calipers, recording the texture of hair, the shape of noses, the color of eyes. He conducted interviews, though calling them that dignified the process too much. He asked questions designed to assess intelligence and temperament, then recorded his conclusions in dense paragraphs filled with scientific-sounding terminology. Amelia was required to assist him, to hold his instruments, to record his measurements in a separate ledger he had brought. She watched him work with growing horror. He showed particular interest in the children already born at Oakridge, measuring them with the same cold precision, making predictions about their future value and utility. He discussed them as if they were a crop to be cultivated, variables in an experiment to be optimized. In the evenings, Beaumont and Theodore would sit in the study, door closed, voices low. Amelia learned to listen at the door, though what she heard made her wish for ignorance. They were planning something larger than Theodore's initial project. Beaumont knew other planters, he said, men of vision who understood that the future of Southern prosperity lay in scientific management of their human property. A network could be established, information could be shared, children with desirable characteristics could be traded or sold to continue breeding lines. It was Lila who first told Amelia about the other thing that was happening, the thing that would prove even more disturbing than the breeding program itself. Lila came to Amelia one morning in late August when Theodore and Beaumont had ridden into Baton Rouge for the day. Lila was 4 months pregnant, her condition beginning to show beneath her loose work dress. She stood in the doorway of Amelia's morning room, twisting her hands, clearly terrified, but driven by something stronger than fear. "Mrs." Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about the babies, the ones that have been born here before you came." Amelia's breath caught. She had assumed, though never asked directly, that there had been other children fathered by Theodore or his father in previous years. It was too common to even remark upon, but the way Lila said it, the fear in her eyes, suggested something more. "Tell me," Amelia said. "Master Whitaker, he'd been selecting certain babies," Lila continued, "the ones with lighter skin, or different eyes, or other things Dr. Beaumont looking for. After they born, after their mamas recover, men come in wagons at night, take the babies away, tell them they bein' sold, but they don't never say where. And Mrs., we ask other folks at neighboring plantations when we allowed to visit, and none of 'em ever see these babies. They just gone." The room tilted. Amelia gripped the arm of her chair. "How many?" she managed to ask. "I don't know exacts. Maybe 20, 25 over the years. Started before the old Master Whitaker died, but it gotten more since Dr. Beaumont started coming around." Amelia dismissed Lila with a shaking hand and sat alone in her morning room as sunlight crept across the floor. She thought of the ledger Theodore, the one with columns for projected value. She thought of Beaumont's network of planters, his talk of optimizing bloodlines, and she understood with sudden sickening clarity that what was happening at Oakridge was not just about producing more enslaved workers for profit. It was something else entirely, something that treated human children as experimental subjects, as merchandise to be distributed according to some grand design that existed only in the twisted logic of men who believed science sanctified their atrocities. That night, when Theodore returned from Baton Rouge, Amelia confronted him. It was the only time in their marriage she directly challenged him. She asked about the children, about where they went, about what he and Beaumont were really doing. Theodore looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes cold in the lamplight. Then he backhanded her across the face hard enough to split her lip. She fell against the settee, tasting blood, hearing him say in that calm, reasonable voice he always used, "You will never question me again, Amelia. Your observations, your records, they are essential to the work. You are complicit. If you speak of this to anyone, if you try to interfere, I will have you committed to the Louisiana Lunatic Asylum in Baton Rouge. I have already spoken to a judge who is a friend of mine. One word from me, and you will spend the rest of your life in chains, being treated as the mad woman you are threatening to become." Amelia wiped the blood from her mouth and said nothing, but something changed in her that night. Some final thread of submission snapped. like a 55-year-old Southern American historian telling a dark secret from the past. If she was complicit, if she could not escape or expose this without destroying herself, then she would find another way. She would become something other than a victim. She would become an instrument of justice, slow and careful and deadly. The late summer of 1837 brought storms that hammered the Louisiana Delta with rain and lightning. Sugarcane crops rotted in the fields throughout East Feliciana Parish. Planters gathered at the courthouse in Baton Rouge, their voices tight with worry about markets and yield, and the labor required to salvage what they could. Theodore attended these meetings, playing the part of concerned neighbor, while privately his attention remained fixed on his experiment, which weather could not interrupt. Clara gave birth in September to a boy with unusually light skin and eyes that would eventually settle into a gray-green shade. Beaumont was present for the delivery, examining the infant with the same cold precision he applied to everything, making notations in his journal. Theodore was pleased. This child, he told Amelia, showed exactly the characteristics they were cultivating. Within a week, men came at night, as Leila had described. Amelia watched from an upstairs window as they loaded a bundle into a covered wagon and drove away toward the South Road. Clara was given 2 days to recover, then sent back to the fields. She moved like something broken, her milk-swollen breasts bound tight beneath her dress, her eyes focused on nothing. Amelia had begun her own documentation by then. While Theodore and Beaumont kept their official records, Amelia started a secret diary that went beyond simple observation. She recorded the women's names, their children's names, approximate dates of birth. She noted which children disappeared and tried to piece together patterns. She also began studying the medicinal herbs in her garden with new purpose, reading through the books her mother had given her about natural remedies and their properties. She paid particular attention to plants with cumulative effects, substances that might cause illness gradually over time, impossible to distinguish from natural ailments. Foxglove, for instance, which grew wild in the woods around Oakridge. In small doses, it could strengthen a failing heart. In slightly larger doses, administered regularly, it could cause weakness, confusion, nausea. Slowly poisoning someone without detection required patience and precision. Amelia had both. By October, Leila gave birth to a girl. This child had darker skin, more typical features. Theodore seemed disappointed. Beaumont examined the baby and made his notations, his tone suggesting this one was less valuable to their purposes. No men came for this child. She stayed with Leila, given the name Sophie. Amelia felt obscene relief that this baby at least would remain with her mother, even though remaining meant a life of enslavement at Oakridge. Eliza's labor came in November and went badly. The baby, a boy, was born dead. Eliza hemorrhaged and, despite Amelia's attempts to help, died 3 days later. Amelia cleaned the blood from Eliza's quarters herself, her hands shaking as she scrubbed. She had genuinely tried to save Eliza, had used every skill she possessed, but it was not enough. The guilt was crushing. She had stood by and watched Eliza be violated, had recorded it in Theodore's ledger, and now the woman was dead. Amelia vomited into a bucket in the laundry room and emerged with her face carefully composed because showing weakness was not permitted at Oakridge. Theodore seemed more annoyed by the loss than grieved. He had invested time and resources in Eliza's pregnancy, and the result was nothing. He made a notation in his ledger about complications to avoid in future selections. Beaumont suggested examining Eliza's body to determine the cause of failure, but Theodore overruled him. The enslaved community needed to see at least the pretense of respect for their dead, he said, or there would be problems with morale and efficiency. They buried Eliza in the small cemetery behind the quarters, a plot marked with wooden crosses and rough stones.
bones. Amelia attended the burial, standing apart from the enslaved people who sang hymns in low voices. She watched Leela holding baby Sophie, watched the way the women touched Clara's shoulder in solidarity, watched the men standing with fists clenched and faces carefully blank. She felt their hatred directed at her as much as at Theodore, and she did not blame them. She was complicit. She had done nothing to stop any of this, but she was preparing. Each week she collected small amounts of foxglove leaves, drying them carefully, grinding them to powder. She added them in tiny quantities to Theodore's evening whiskey, not enough to make him obviously sick, just enough to make him feel poorly, to gradually weaken him. She told herself it was justice. She told herself she was doing what had to be done. The truth was more complicated.
Like a 55-year-old Southern American historian or preacher telling a dark secret from the past, she was becoming something she did not recognize, driven by rage and guilt and a desperate need to strike back at the man who had turned her into a witness to atrocities. Winter came early. By December, frost killed the last of the garden plants. Amelia collected the final foxglove seeds, storing them carefully for next year. She had learned patience. Revenge, she understood now, was not a sudden act, but a long campaign. She could wait. She had nothing but time and hatred to sustain her. Beaumont returned to Oakridge for the Christmas season, bringing with him documents that he and Theodore studied in the locked study. Amelia did not know what those papers contained, but she knew they related to the network Beaumont had mentioned, connections with other plantations, other men conducting similar experiments. She imagined a web spreading across the South, children being moved like chess pieces, all in service of some grand theory about racial purity, scientific progress that was really just cruelty dressed in academic language. On Christmas Eve, the enslaved people were given a holiday, as was customary. They gathered in the quarters for their own celebration, such as it could be under the circumstances. Amelia watched from the house as they sang and tried to find moments of joy despite everything. Lila held Sophie close, swaying to the music. Clara stood alone at the edge of the group, staring at nothing. Amelia turned away from the window and poured herself a glass of wine, her hands steady now. She had moved past horror into something colder and more determined. The new year of 1838 arrived with freezing rain that turned the roads to mud and kept everyone confined. Theodore and Beaumont spent long hours planning the expansion of their project. Amelia spent her time documenting everything, building her secret record, and adding tiny amounts of poison to her husband's drinks. The foxglove was working, but slowly. Theodore had begun complaining of fatigue, occasional nausea, a general malaise he attributed to the winter weather. No doctor was called. Why would he call a doctor for something so minor? Amelia smiled at him over the breakfast table and asked if he wanted more coffee. He did. She poured it carefully, her hands perfectly steady, and watched him drink it down. What do you think Amelia should do? Could you maintain the same composure in her situation? Let us know in the comments. And if this story is pulling you in, hit that like button and share this with someone who appreciates dark historical tales. Let's continue discovering what happened at Oakridge. March of 1838 brought false spring to southern Louisiana, warm days that coaxed early buds from the fruit trees before late frosts killed them. Theodore's health continued its gradual decline. He moved more slowly now, complained of weakness in his limbs, difficulty concentrating. Amelia suggested he see a doctor in Baton Rouge, but he refused, insisting it was merely the lingering effects of winter. His pride would not allow him to admit vulnerability. Beaumont noticed during his April visit. The doctor examined Theodore in the study, Amelia not present for once,
and emerged looking concerned. He recommended reduced physical activity, better nutrition, perhaps a tonic. He wrote out a prescription for a compound that could be obtained from an apothecary in town. Amelia collected the prescription and filled it, but she also began reducing the foxglove doses. She did not want Theodore dead yet. She wanted him weak, dependent, unable to continue his breeding program with the same vigor. She wanted him to suffer as she had suffered, to lose control of his body as he had taken control of others' bodies. But her plans were complicated by a new development. 2 women were pregnant again, Lila for a second time, and a woman named Violet, who worked in the main house as a chambermaid. Violet was 26, educated by previous owners who had taught her to read before economic troubles forced them to sell herself. She was intelligent, observant, and Amelia had noticed the way Violet watched everything, filing away information as if she too were keeping records. Amelia began to feel a strange kinship with Violet, though they could never acknowledge it openly. Both were trapped in Oakridge's nightmare. Both were documenting it in their own ways. Both were waiting for something to change. When they passed in hallways, Violet's eyes would meet Amelia's for just a moment, a communication without words. They understood each other. It was Violet who finally told Amelia one morning in late April, when Theodore and Beaumont had ridden into Baton Rouge for a meeting with other planters. Amelia found Violet alone in the laundry room, washing linens in water gone gray with soap. Amelia sent the other workers away on pretended errands, waiting until she and Violet were alone before speaking. "I know you have been watching," Amelia said quietly. "I know you see everything that happens here, just as I do, and I know you understand what my husband's doing." Violet's hands stilled in the washwater. She looked at her with those intelligent eyes, assessing, calculating risk. After a long moment,
She said carefully, "What is it you want to know, Mrs.? Everything you think I should know? Everything that might help me stop this?" Violet glanced toward the door, ensuring they were truly alone. Then she spoke in a low voice, her words precise despite the danger of what she was revealing. "There is something Master Whitaker has kept hidden from you. A boy. His name is Jacob. He was born 8 years ago before you came to Oakridge. His mama was a woman named Miriam who worked in the house. Master Whitaker kept Jacob because he was the first one born, looking almost white, with gray eyes and light hair like his own. Miriam got sold away to Mississippi when Jacob was weaned, and the boy has been living in a cabin apart from the rest of us ever since." Amelia felt ice spreading through her chest. "Why have I never seen this child? Master Whitaker keeps him separate. He has been teaching Jacob things, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, things he does not allow the rest of us to learn. I have heard him and Dr. Beaumont talking about the boy. They say Jacob is proof that their breeding theories work." And Mrs. Violet's voice dropped even lower. "They are planning to use him. When he gets older, when he reaches manhood, they plan to have him father children himself. They want to create a whole line of people who look white but are still property under the law. People they can sell for fortunes to buyers who want servants that can pass in white society." The horror of it struck Amelia like a physical blow. Theodore had fathered a son and was grooming that child to continue the cycle of exploitation, to become another instrument of the same violation that had brought him into existence. It was a legacy of trauma designed to perpetuate itself across generation. "Where is this boy?" Amelia asked. "In a cabin on the east side of the property, past the barn. Master Whitaker visits him most afternoons for lessons. But, Mrs., you should know Jacob is smart, real smart. He understands what he is, what Master Whitaker plans for him. I have seen the look in that boy's eyes. He is angry, and he is waiting something. I do not know what, but he is not the obedient tool Master Whittaker thinks. Amelia left the laundry room with Violet's words echoing in her mind. Jacob, a son Theodore had kept, trained, shaped for some purpose. She needed to see this boy, to understand what 8 years under Theodore's instruction had created. That evening at dinner, Amelia took a calculated risk. She mentioned casually that she had heard there was a child at Oakridge receiving an education. How unusual that seemed. Theodore's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his gray eyes fixing on her with sudden sharpness. "Where did you hear that?" His voice was controlled, but she heard the warning beneath it. "Servants' talk," Amelia said with practiced indifference. "I pay attention to my household." Theodore set down his fork with deliberate care. "Jacob is part of the project, an experiment in potential. He demonstrates what careful selection and proper training can produce. I would like to meet him." "No," Amelia met his gaze steadily. "I have been present for every other aspect of this work. I have documented births, recorded characteristics, witnessed things that will haunt me until I die. Why should I not meet this child who is apparently so important to your vision?" The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. She could see him calculating, weighing whether her request posed any real threat. His illness had made him more cautious, less certain of his control. Finally, he nodded once. "Tomorrow afternoon, but you will observe only. You will not speak to him unless I permit it, and you will certainly not interfere with his education." The next day dragged with anticipation that bordered on dread. Amelia moved through her morning tasks mechanically, her mind focused on the coming meeting. When Theodore finally came to collect her after the midday meal, she followed him across the yard toward a cabin set apart from the slave quarters. It was better built than the others, with glass windows instead of shutters and a small porch with actual steps. Inside, the space was spare but clean. A narrow bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding books that Amelia recognized from Theodore's own library, and at a small desk near the window, a boy sat working through arithmetic problems on a slate, his handwriting neat and precise. Jacob looked up when they entered. Amelia's breath caught. The resemblance to Theodore was unmistakable in the angular face, the set of the jaw, those pale gray eyes. But his skin was lighter than she had expected, light enough that, in different clothes, in a different context, he might pass unquestioned in white society. His hair was brown with golden undertones falling across his forehead as he studied them. "Jacob, this is Mrs.
Whittaker," Theodore said. His voice carried a tone Amelia had never heard before, something almost like pride. The boy stood smoothly, executing a formal bow that spoke of careful instruction. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whittaker." His diction was perfect, without the dialect that marked most enslaved people's speech. Someone had worked hard to train that out of him. "It is good to meet you, Jacob," Amelia managed. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask him questions, wanted to understand what this child thought and felt behind that carefully neutral expression. But Theodore was watching her closely. For the next half hour, Theodore demonstrated Jacob's abilities like a man showing off a prized horse. The boy read passages from books well beyond what most 8-year-olds could manage. He worked through mathematical problems with ease. He answered questions about history and geography with accuracy that suggested hours of study. And through it all, his face remained a mask, revealing nothing. When they finally left, walking back toward the main house, Theodore spoke with barely contained satisfaction. "You see, he is proof that the theories are sound. With proper breeding and education, exceptional results are possible. In another 10 years, when he reaches maturity, he will be ready for the next phase." "What next phase?" Amelia asked, though cold certainty was already forming in her gut. He will father children of his own, of course. I have been corresponding with Hargrove about potential matches. There are several plantations with girls from similar breeding programs. We will create pairings based on optimal characteristics. Jacob's children will represent the culmination of everything we have learned. Amelia stopped walking. You are planning to use your own son as breeding stock? He is not my son in any legal sense, Theodore said calmly. He is property, exceptionally valuable property, but property nonetheless, and he will fulfill the purpose for which he was created. It is no different than using a prize bull to improve one's cattle. He is a child, a human child. Theodore's expression hardened. He is a tool in a grand experiment. Do not allow yourself to become sentimental, Amelia. Sentiment has no place in scientific progress. That night, Amelia sat in her room with her hidden diary open before her, but found herself unable to write. The horror of what Theodore planned for Jacob seemed to dwarf even the other atrocities. This was not just exploitation or trafficking. This was the creation of a self-perpetuating system of abuse designed to continue across generations. Jacob would be forced to inflict on others what had been inflicted upon his mother, creating children who would themselves be trapped in the same cycle. She had to find a way to stop it. But how? Theodore held all the power. The law was entirely on his side. Even if she somehow managed to help Jacob escape, where would he go? How would a light-skinned child of ambiguous status survive in a world that demanded clear categories? The answer, when it came to her, was both simple and terrible. She needed an ally with real power, someone whose moral authority carried weight, someone who could not be easily dismissed or threatened. She needed someone from outside the plantation system, someone with connections beyond Louisiana. She needed a minister. The Reverend Elias Thornton arrived in Baton Rouge in early August, assigned to the Presbyterian Church by the Northern Synod. He was 35, unmarried, a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, with what the local congregation would soon learn were dangerously progressive views on slavery. Not abolitionist exactly, he was too careful for that, but he preached about Christian duty, about treating all people as children of God, about the spiritual dangers of absolute power. Amelia attended his first sermon and sat in the Whitaker family pew, listening as he spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan, with emphasis that made several plantation owners shift uncomfortably. After the service, she approached him in the receiving line, introduced herself with perfect propriety, and mentioned that she would value his counsel on some difficult spiritual matters. Reverend Thornton had intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see more than people wanted to reveal. "I would be honored, Mrs. Whitaker. Shall I call at Oakridge?" "That would be most appropriate," Amelia said, aware of Theodore watching from across the church lawn. "My husband and I would be pleased to receive you." The minister's first visit came the following Tuesday. Amelia had prepared carefully, ensuring that Theodore would be present for the initial meeting, that everything would appear perfectly normal and proper. They sat in the front parlor, drinking tea, discussing theology and church matters, with the careful politeness of strangers establishing boundaries. But when Reverend Thornton asked if he might tour the plantation to better understand the lives of his potential congregants, Amelia saw her opening. Theodore could hardly refuse without appearing suspicious, so he agreed with poorly concealed reluctance. Amelia led the tour, with Theodore trailing behind. His breathing labored from the exertion. She made sure they passed the slave quarters at a time when people would be visible. Lila was there holding little Sophie, now a year old. Clara stood at her cabin door, that hollow look in her eyes that never changed. Violet moved between buildings, her pregnancy now obvious,
her movements careful and deliberate.
"You have a large population here," Reverend Thornton observed. His tone was neutral, but Amelia saw how his gaze lingered on the women, on the children, cataloging detail. "Oakridge is prosperous," Theodore said. "We manage our resources efficiently." "Resources," the minister repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe people." The tension in that moment was palpable. Theodore's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They completed the tour and returned to the house, where Reverend Thornton took his leave with promises to return soon for further spiritual discussion. After the minister's carriage disappeared down the drive, Theodore turned to Amelia. "What are you doing?" "Seeking spiritual guidance," Amelia said calmly. "Is that not what a Christian woman should do? You have made me party to many things, Theodore. My conscience requires counsel." "Be careful, Amelia, very careful." But the minister did return, again and again over the following weeks. Sometimes Theodore was present for their discussions, sitting in his study as they talked theology. Other times Theodore's increasing fatigue kept him to his room, and Amelia met with Reverend Thornton alone in the parlor, with Violet serving tea, her presence a silent reminder of what they were really discussing. Amelia was careful. She never spoke directly about the breeding program, never made explicit accusations. Instead, she asked theoretical questions. What was a Christian's duty when witnessing sin? What should one do when complicit in evil but powerless to stop it? How did one balance obedience to earthly authority against obedience to divine law? Reverend Thornton was equally careful in his response, but Amelia could see understanding dawning in his eyes. He began asking his own questions, gentle and indirect, about the children at Oakridge, about their fathers, about what happened to babies born on the plantation. Amelia answered with vague gestures and meaningful silences, letting him piece together the truth. In mid-September, Violet went into labor. It happened in the afternoon, sudden and hard. Amelia attended the birth as she always did now, her presence required by Theodore, even though he himself stayed away from the actual delivery. Violet labored for 6 hours, her face slick with sweat, her hands gripping the bed frame until her knuckles went white. When the baby finally came, a girl with skin lighter than Violet's, but darker than Jacob's, Amelia wrapped the infant and placed her in her mother's arms. "Her name is Clara," Violet said, her voice hoarse from screaming. "After the first one, who lost everything." Amelia looked at this woman who had helped her, who had shared information at great risk, who had just endured agony to bring forth a child she might not be allowed to keep. "I will not let them take her," Amelia said quietly. "I promise you, Violet, whatever it costs me, I will not let them take this baby." It was a rash promise, perhaps, an impossible one, but she meant it. She had stood by too long, witnessed too much. If she could not save all the children who had already been stolen, she could at least fight for this one. That night, Theodore came to inspect Violet's baby. He brought his ledger, making his usual notations about characteristics and potential value. Amelia watched him with barely concealed rage. When he finished and turned to leave, she followed him to his study. "This one stays," Amelia said. Theodore looked up from his desk. "That is not your decision. I am making it my decision. Violet's baby will not be sold. She will remain here with her mother. And if I disagree, then I will go to Reverend Thornton and tell him everything. Every detail of your breeding program, every child sold through Hargrove's network, every aspect of your grand experiment. I will give you documentation with names and dates. I will destroy you." It was a dangerous gambit. Theodore could still have her committed, could still silence her through force or institutionalization. But his illness had weakened him, and they both knew it. More importantly, Reverend Thornton's presence in Baton Rouge had changed the calculation. The minister had connections to the Northern Church, to people who might actually listen if accusations were made by a clergyman rather than a supposedly hysterical woman. Theodore studied her for a long moment. "You think you have power here? You think you can dictate terms to me in my own house?" "I think we both have something to lose," Amelia said, "and I think you are practical enough to recognize a stalemate when you see one. Violet's baby stays. That is the price for my continued silence. 1 child, that is all you ask." Amelia hesitated, then pressed further. "And no more women selected for your program. What has been done is done, but no more. You ask me to abandon years of work. I ask you to stop committing evil in the name of science. If you refuse, I will ensure that everything you have built comes crashing down, even if it destroys me in the process." The standoff lasted for days.
Theodore said neither yes nor no, simply withdrawing into cold silence. Amelia held firm, continuing her meetings with Reverend Thornton, continuing to document everything in her hidden diary. Violet remained in her cabin with baby Clara, suspended in uncertainty, not knowing whether the child would be taken in the night, as so many others had been. Then, one evening in late September, everything changed. Just when we thought Amelia had gained some small measure of control over the horrors at Oakridge, new complications emerged that will test her resolve and her courage to their absolute limits. If this story is gripping you, share it with someone who appreciates complex historical mystery. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss our investigations into America's hidden past. The darkest revelations are still ahead. Reverend Thornton arrived at Oakridge unannounced on a Thursday morning, his face grave. Amelia received him in the front parlor, immediately sensing that something had shifted. The minister waited until Violet had served coffee and departed before speaking. "I have been making inquiries," he said quietly, "about the matters we have discussed. I spoke with colleagues in Mobile and New Orleans, with people who might know about certain networks operating between Plantation." Amelia's pulse quickened. "And what did you learn?" "Enough to trouble me deep, enough to suggest that what happens here is part of something larger and more organized than isolated incidents of immorality. Mrs. Whitaker, I need you to tell me directly. Are children being bred deliberately at Oakridge and then sold into trafficking networks?" Amelia had spent weeks building up to this moment, preparing careful half-truths and implications. But faced with the direct question, with this man who genuinely seemed to care about justice, she found herself unable to maintain the pretense. "Yes," she said simply. "My husband and a doctor from New Orleans named Beaumont have been conducting what they call a breeding experiment. They select women, my husband fathers children, and those with certain characteristics are sold through a man named Edmund Hargrove to buyers in the Caribbean and South America. I have been forced to witness and document everything. I have records, Reverend Thornton, names, dates, physical descriptions, evidence of at least 40 children who have disappeared from this plantation over the past decade." The minister's face had gone pale. "God in heaven! And you have proof of this?" "I have documentation, but I have not yet determined what to do with it. If I go to local authorities, they will dismiss me as a hysterical woman, or my husband will have me committed to the lunatic asylum. The law gives him every right to do with his property as he wishes, and that includes both the enslaved people and, to a large extent, me." Reverend Thornton stood and paced to the window, looking out over the grounds of Oakridge. "This is worse than I imagine. What you describe is not merely the sin of slavery, which is bad enough, but a systematic abuse that turns human beings into experimental subjects, into merchandise in a trafficking scheme." "Yes," Amelia said, "that is exactly what it is. I need to see your documentation, and then we need to determine how to proceed. There are people in New Orleans, in the state government, who might listen. There are federal prosecutors who handle smuggling cases. If we can prove international trafficking, there might be legal recourse even in Louisiana." Amelia felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. "I will get you the documents, but Reverend, you must understand the risk. My husband has threatened me, and he has connections throughout this region.
If he learns what we are planning, then we must be very careful, the minister said, and we must move quickly. They made plans for Amelia to copy portions of her documentation and pass them to Reverend Thornton during his next official visit. He would take them to contacts in New Orleans and Mobile, people he trusted to handle such explosive information properly. It would take time, weeks, or possibly months to build a case strong enough to overcome the legal and social protections Theodore enjoyed. But it was a start. Amelia should have known that secrets at Oakridge never stayed hidden for long. 2 days after Reverend Thornton's visit, Amelia was in her morning room working on her needlework, a pretense of normalcy she maintained even as her mind raced with plans and possibilities, when Theodore entered without knocking. His face was flushed, despite his usual pallor, his eyes bright with anger. "You have been corresponding with the minister." It was not a question. Amelia's hands stilled on her embroidery. "He is our clergyman. Of course I speak with him. Do not play games with me, Amelia. I know what you are doing. I know you have been feeding him information about our private affairs." "Your affairs?" Amelia corrected. "I have merely been seeking spiritual counsel on matters that trouble my conscience."
Theodore crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise. "You will cease all contact with Reverend Thornton. You will not speak to him again at church or anywhere else. You will not write to him. You will not continue whatever scheme you have concocted." Amelia met his eyes steadily, refusing to flinch, though his grip was painful. "Oh, what, Theodore? Will you lock me away? We have had this conversation before. I have taken precautions. If anything happens to me, if I suddenly disappear or fall mysteriously ill, information will reach people you cannot control." "You think yourself so clever," Theodore hissed, "but you forget that I control everything in this house. Every person, every action, every breath you take." He released her wrist, and she resisted the urge to rub the reddened skin. After he left, Amelia sat very still, thinking through the implications. Theodore knew she was working against him, which meant he would be watching her more carefully, making it harder to pass information to Reverend Thornton. She needed another way to communicate, another channel that Theodore could not easily monitor. The answer came from an unexpected source. That evening, Jacob appeared at the kitchen door asking for Violet. It was unusual. The boy rarely approached the main house, but when Violet emerged, he spoke to her in a low voice, pressed something into her hand, and departed quickly. Violet found Amelia later and showed her what Jacob had given her, a folded piece of paper with careful handwriting. The message was brief. "I know what my father plans for me. I want to help stop him. I can carry messages. He does not watch me closely." Amelia stared at the note, her heart pounding. Jacob, 8 years old, was offering to become a courier in a conspiracy against his own father. The risk to him was enormous. If Theodore discovered it, the punishment would be severe, but it was also an opportunity she could not ignore. "Tell him yes," Amelia said to Violet. "Tell him to be extremely careful, and tell him I am grateful for his courage." Through September and into October, a delicate network of communication developed. Jacob carried messages between Amelia and Reverend Thornton, hiding them in the books he borrowed from Theodore's library, retrieving responses tucked into volumes he returned. It was slow and dangerous, but it worked. Amelia passed copies of her documentation page by page, and Reverend Thornton took them to his contacts in New Orleans. But the strain was showing on everyone. Violet moved through her days with constant vigilance. Baby Clara, always close, her eyes darting at every sound. Lila had grown gaunt and silent, barely speaking even to other enslaved people. Clara continued her hollow existence, a ghost moving through the sugarcane fields, and Amelia felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. Every decision she made put others at risk. Every step forward increased the danger. The crisis came on a cool morning in mid-October. Amelia was in the garden, collecting the last herbs before the first hard frost, when she heard shouting from the direction of the slave quarters. She ran toward the sound and found Theodore in a rage, standing over Jacob, who was on his knees in the dirt. "Explain this." Theodore held up a piece of paper, one of Amelia's messages. Jacob must have dropped it or failed to hide it properly. The boy said nothing,
his face a mask, even as blood trickled from his split lip where Theodore had struck him. Amelia forced herself to walk forward calmly, her heart hammering. "Theodore, what is happening?" "This boy," Theodore spat, "this ungrateful creature I have educated and sheltered, has been sneaking messages about my private business, messages meant for that meddling minister." Amelia's mind raced. If Theodore knew about the messages, he would know she was behind them. The entire plan was compromised, but she could not let Jacob take the full punishment for following her orders. "I asked him to carry them," Amelia said clearly. "He was following my instructions." "You admit it?" "I admit nothing except asking a child to perform a simple errand. If you have constructed some elaborate conspiracy in your mind, that is your concern, not mine. You have betrayed me. After everything, after all my warnings, you have conspired against me. I have sought spiritual counsel and shared my concerns with a minister of God. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should examine your own actions rather than condemning mine." The confrontation was building to something terrible. Amelia could see Theodore's hands shaking, could see the violence barely contained beneath his fury. Violet had emerged from a nearby cabin, holding baby Clara, her face stricken with fear. Other enslaved people had stopped their work, watching from a safe distance. And then Theodore made his decision. "Jacob, go to your cabin and wait there. You will be dealt with later." To the overseer who had come running at the commotion, "Fetch Dr. Reynolds from Baton Rouge. My wife has been suffering from delusions and hysteria. It is time she received proper medical attention."
Amelia felt ice flood through her veins. This was the threat Theodore had held over her since the beginning, the ultimate weapon he could deploy to silence her completely. Commitment to the Louisiana lunatic asylum, where she would be locked away possibly for years, possibly forever, labeled as insane and stripped of all credibility. "You cannot do this," Amelia said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I can do whatever is necessary to protect my household and my interests," Theodore replied. "You have proven yourself incapable of rational thought. You have become a danger to yourself and to the proper order of this plantation. I'm acting out of concern for your welfare." The overseer had already departed toward the stable to saddle a horse. Within an hour, Dr. Reynolds would be on his way from town. Amelia had perhaps 60 minutes to prevent the destruction of everything she had worked toward. She looked at Jacob, still kneeling in the dirt, at Violet holding baby Clara, at Leela standing in her cabin doorway with Sophie clinging to her skirts, at all the faces watching this confrontation, all the people whose lives would continue in suffering if she failed now. "I have documentation," Amelia said quietly, "of everything. Every woman you violated, every child born and stolen, every transaction with Hargrove, every conversation with Beaumont about your breeding experiments. I have names, dates, amounts paid. I have copied letters describing your international trafficking network, and I have given all of it to Reverend Thornton, with explicit instructions to send copies to newspapers in New Orleans, Mobile, and Baton Rouge, to the state attorney general, to federal marshals, and to church authorities throughout the South if anything happens to me." Theodore's face went from purple to pale. "You are lying." "Am I?" Amelia walked closer to him, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You taught me to observe, to document, to plan with patience. Did you truly believe I was doing that only for your benefit? I have been building a case against you for over a year. Every time you forced me to witness your crimes, I was recording them. Every conversation you had with Beaumont and Hargrove that you thought I was not paying attention to, I was memorizing. Every child that disappeared in the night, I noted the date and description. No one would believe you," Theodore said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Perhaps not if I were alone, but Reverend Thornton believes me, and he has connections to people in Baton Rouge, in the federal government, in newspapers that are not controlled by plantation interests. Even in the South, Theodore, there are limits to what people will tolerate. Slavery is one thing. It is legal, sanctioned, woven into our economy. But international child trafficking, organized breeding programs documented like livestock experiments, that is something else entirely. That is scandalous enough to bring scrutiny even here." Violet stepped forward, still holding baby Clara. "Mrs. Amelia is not the only one with records," she said clearly. "I have been writing too. So has Jacob. So have others. We may be enslaved, but we can read and write. And we have been documenting everything. You think we are property that cannot testify, but written records are different. And if something happens to Mrs. Amelia, if she disappears into that asylum, we will make sure those records reach people who will publish them. It was a tremendous risk for Violet to speak so directly, but Amelia understood the strategy. This was not just Amelia's word anymore. This was multiple sources, multiple forms of documentation, a case that could not be easily dismissed as one woman's hysteria. Theodore looked at the enslaved people gathering around the scene, looked at Jacob, still kneeling in the dirt, looked at Violet, holding baby Clara, at Leela standing in her cabin doorway with Sophie clinging to her skirts, at all the faces watching this confrontation, all the people whose lives would continue in suffering if she failed now. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "I want you to stop," Amelia said. "Completely. No more women selected for breeding. No more children taken and sold. No more participation in Hargrove's network. Jacob will continue his education, but will be legally freed when he reaches 21, and documented in your will. The women who have borne children here will be treated with basic humanity and their children allowed to remain with them, and you will live with what you have done knowing that if you violate any of these conditions, everything becomes public. You ask me to dismantle everything I have built? I am not asking. I am telling you the price of avoiding scandal and prosecution. You can accept these terms, or you can try to have me committed and discover whether my documentation reaches authorities before you can silence me. Those are your only choices. The standoff lasted for an eternal moment. The morning sun had climbed higher, making shadows shorter, but the scene felt frozen in time. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented.
An enslaved woman speaking truth to a master, a wife threatening her husband with evidence of his crimes, a conspiracy that crossed every social boundary. Theodore's face worked through a series of expressions: rage, calculation, frustration, and finally, a cold resignation. "Very well," he said at last. "But understand this, Amelia. You have won a battle, not the war. We will live here together in this stalemate, and I will make sure you suffer for this betrayal in every way I can devise that does not violate your explicit conditions. You will remain my wife, trapped in this house, complicit in everything that has already been done. That guilt will eat at you for the rest of your life." "Yes," Amelia agreed quietly, "it will. I will carry the weight of what I witnessed and did not stop quickly enough. I will bear that burden until I die. But at least no more children will be stolen. At least the horror stops here today. That is the only redemption available to me." Theodore turned and walked back toward the main house, his gait unsteady, the morning's confrontation having clearly exhausted him. Amelia watched him go, then turned to Jacob. "Stand up," she said gently. The boy rose, wiping blood from his lip. His gray eyes, so like his father's, met hers with an expression far too old for an 8-year-old. "Thank you, Mrs. Amelia," he said softly. "You were brave," Amelia told him. "Too brave for a child to need to be. I'm sorry for the position I put you in." "I wanted to help," Jacob said. "I know what he planned for. I know what I was supposed to become." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "I will not be what he wanted. I will not continue this. I promise you that." Amelia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She looked at Violet, at baby Clara sleeping in her mother's arms, at Lila and Sophie watching from their cabin. The enslaved community had witnessed everything, had seen one of their own speak directly to the master, had seen a white woman threaten her husband on their behalf. It changed nothing about their legal status, nothing about the fundamental injustice of their situation, but perhaps it offered some small measure of hope that resistance was possible, that the powerful were not entirely untouchable. When the overseer returned later that afternoon to report that he had been unable to find Dr. Reynolds in town, Theodore simply waved him away. The crisis had passed. The asylum was no longer part of the plan. What remained was exactly what Amelia had described: a stalemate, a cold war within the walls of Oakridge Plantation. Two people bound together by shared crimes and mutual hatred, living out their days in a hell of their own creation. The years that followed were years of gray survival. Theodore kept his word because he had no choice, but he made Amelia's life miserable in every way his position permitted. He spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. He excluded her from all social events, telling friends she had become reclusive due to delicate health. He controlled her access to money, to correspondence, to everything beyond the immediate grounds of Oakridge. But the breeding program stopped. No more women were selected. No more children were taken in the night. Violet raised baby Clara in relative peace, teaching her daughter to read in secret, passing on skills that might someday lead to freedom. Lila kept Sophie close, finding some measure of comfort in watching her daughter grow. Clara continued her broken existence, but was at least spared further violation. Jacob continued his education, but now Amelia participated in it openly, bringing him books, teaching him herself. When Theodore's increasing illness prevented regular lessons, she watched the boy grow from 8 to 10 to 12, watched intelligence sharpen into keen perception, watched anger mature into determination. He would keep his promise. She knew he would not become what Theodore had intended. Theodore's health declined steadily. The damage Amelia's foxglove poisoning had done to his heart was irreversible. By 1841, he could barely manage the stairs without stopping to rest. By 1842, he had largely withdrawn to his study, managing the plantation through overseers and written instructions. Amelia did not gloat over his deterioration. She felt nothing for him anymore. Neither hatred nor pity, just a cold emptiness where emotion used to live. Reverend Taunton remained in Baton Rouge, a steady presence and a reminder that the documentation still existed, that the threat of exposure remained real. Hargrove's network had indeed collapsed when federal authorities raided a plantation in Alabama for smuggling violations and found records of the child trafficking operation. Several planters fled the country. Beaumont disappeared, presumably to the Caribbean, where many slaveholders went when things became too hot in the States. Amelia knew her victory was partial at best. The children who had already been taken were gone forever, lost in the slave markets of Cuba and Brazil, their fates unknown and unknowable. Clara would never recover from what had been done to her. Lila would always carry the grief of her stolen son, and Amelia herself would always bear the guilt of having waited so long, of having been complicit for months before finally acting. In March of 1843, Theodore died.
The doctor said heart failure, which was accurate enough. He was 39 years old. They buried him in the family cemetery with minimal ceremony. Amelia stood at the grave in her black mourning dress and felt nothing except relief that it was over. His will, written in the final year of his life, left Oakridge to Amelia, with specific provisions about Jacob's education and eventual manumission at age 21. It was perhaps the only decent thing Theodore had ever done, acknowledging this son in the only way the law permitted, ensuring he would eventually gain freedom. Amelia suspected it was motivated less by love than by a desire to prove his theory had merit, that Jacob could succeed as a free man, and thus validate the entire experiment. But the motivation did not matter. The result was what counted. Amelia lived on at Oakridge for 11 more years. She never remarried. She managed the plantation as well as she could within slavery's constraints, treating the enslaved people with as much humanity as the system allowed, which was never enough. She established a small school where children could learn to read and write, knowing this was technically illegal, but doing it anyway. She saved money and purchased freedom for Violet and baby Clara in 1849, sending them north with letters of introduction to Quaker families in Philadelphia who helped refugees from slavery. Lila asked to remain at Oakridge with Sophie. The plantation was the only home she knew, and she feared the uncertainty of freedom more than the familiar routines of enslavement. Amelia understood. Trauma makes people cling to what they know, even when what they know is terrible. Jacob was freed in 1851, when he turned 21, as Theodore's will had specified. Amelia gave him money for travel, letters of introduction, and a copy of all the documentation about his origins. "If you want to know where you came from," she told him, "it is all here, but you are not defined by how you began. You can be whoever you choose to become." Jacob took the papers, thanked her, and left Oakridge. He traveled north to Philadelphia, found work as a clerk, married a free black woman, and built a life under an assumed name. He never returned to Louisiana. His children would grow up knowing they were descended from enslaved people, but not knowing the specific horror of their grandfather's breeding program. That knowledge died with Jacob in 1897, though researchers would eventually piece it together from the documents Amelia preserved. Amelia herself grew increasingly frail as the 1850s progressed. The years of stress, guilt, and constant vigilance had taken their toll. She developed a persistent cough that no amount of herbal remedies could cure. By the spring of 1854, she knew she was dying. Consumption, the doctors said, though Amelia suspected it was something else, some deeper exhaustion of the spirit that manifested in the body. In her final weeks, she spent hours with her hidden diary, adding final entries and organizing all the documentation she had accumulated. She wrote detailed instructions for her lawyer about how the papers should be sealed and preserved, stipulating they should not be opened for 100 years. She wanted the truth to be known eventually, but not so soon that it would destroy the lives of those still living who had been victims of Oakridge's horrors. Lila came to visit her in those last days, bringing Sophie, now a young woman of 16. They sat beside Amelia's bed in comfortable silence. These three women who had been bound together by shared trauma, each carrying their portion of grief. "Did we do enough?" Amelia asked Lila. "Did stopping it when we did matter, or was it too little, too late?" Lila considered the question carefully before answering. "You can't give back what was taken, Mrs. Amelia. My son is gone. Clara's boy is gone. All those babies disappeared into places we will never know. That cannot be undone." She paused, looking at Sophie sitting quiet beside her. "But my daughter is here. Violet's daughter is free in Philadelphia. Jacob has a chance at a life. That is something. It is not redemption, maybe, but it is something. I should have acted sooner," Amelia whispered. "The moment I understood what Theodore was doing, I should have found a way to stop him." "Maybe," Lila said. "Or maybe you would have died, or been locked away, and it would have continued anyway. We cannot know what would have happened in a different world. We only know what happened in this one." She reached out and took Amelia's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable under different circumstances. "You did what you could, when you could do it. That is all any of us can do." Amelia died on May 3, 1854, at the age of 42. She was buried beside Theodore in the family cemetery, an irony that would not have escaped her. Her will divided Oakridge's land among the enslaved people who remained there, freeing all of them and giving them ownership of small parcels. It was challenged in court by distant Whitaker relatives, and most of the formerly enslaved people
Eventually sold their portions because they lacked the capital to work the land and faced constant harassment from neighboring white landowners. But for a brief moment, the vision of justice Amelia had fought for was partially realized. The documentation she preserved, Theodore's ledgers, her hidden diary, the letters and records of Hargrove's network, was sealed by her lawyer and placed in storage in the East Feliciana Parish Courthouse. A note on the outside of the box read, "Not to be opened until 1950. Parish clerks transferred it from storage room to storage room over the decades, its contents forgotten by everyone except a few archivists who maintained the courthouse records. The main house at Oakridge burned in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War ended. Whether it was accident, arson by former enslaved people, or deliberate destruction by Amelia's heirs, who could not bear what the place represented, no one recorded. The slave quarters were gradually dismantled, their lumber used for other buildings. The land was subdivided and sold to small farmers. The cemetery was neglected, overgrown with brambles and kudzu. By the early 20th century, few people in East Feliciana Parish remembered that Oakridge Plantation had ever existed. It became one of thousands of forgotten places where slavery's horrors had unfolded, its specific crimes lost to time and deliberate forgetting until 1954. A historian from the University of Louisiana named Margaret Fletcher was researching Antebellum plantation records for her dissertation. She was in the East Feliciana Parish Courthouse going through old property records when she found the sealed box with its century-old instruction. Curious, she brought it to the parish clerk's attention. After confirming that the 100-year seal period had passed,
They opened it. What they found shocked even researchers accustomed to slavery's documentation. Amelia's diary was the most damaging, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, but with precise details about dates, names, and transactions. Theodore's ledgers provided cold scientific notation of his breeding program. Letters between Beaumont, Hargrove, and Theodore laid out the full scope of the trafficking network, and Violet's hidden records, written in tiny script on whatever scraps of paper she could find, provided the enslaved people's perspective on what they had endured. Dr. Fletcher initially did not want to publish what she had found. The material was too disturbing, too inflammatory, but her advisors convinced her that this was exactly the kind of primary source documentation that needed to be preserved and studied, no matter how painful. Her dissertation, completed in 1956, included extensive excerpts from the Oakridge documents. It was published by a university press in 1958 under the title Oakridge, a case study in scientific racism and domestic trafficking in Antebellum, Louisiana. The book caused controversy. Some historians praised it for its unflinching examination of slavery's pseudo-scientific justifications. Others criticized it as sensationalist, or accused Fletcher of focusing on extreme cases that were not representative of typical plantation management. Descendants of the Whitaker family tried unsuccessfully to suppress publication, arguing it defamed their ancestors. But the documentation was real. The crimes had happened. And slowly, over the following decades, other researchers began finding similar evidence at other plantations, proof that what happened at Oakridge was not unique, but part of a broader pattern of systematic exploitation, masked by the language of science and progress. Jacob's descendants learned about their family's origins when Fletcher's book was published. His grandson, Robert Cunningham, Jacob had taken his wife's maiden name when they married, was a physician in Philadelphia. He read the book and finally understood why his grandfather had never spoken about his childhood, why he had seemed to carry such profound sadness beneath his successful life. Robert wrote to Fletcher, thanking her for preserving the truth, even though it was painful, and he provided family records that helped researchers trace what had happened to Jacob after he left Louisiana. Violet's granddaughter, a teacher in Boston, also contacted Fletcher after reading the book. She shared stories that Violet had told her family about Oakridge, about Amelia, about the resistance that happened in whispers and coded messages. These oral histories, combined with the written documentation, created a fuller picture of how enslaved people survived and resisted, even in the most horrific circumstances. Leela's descendants were harder to trace. Sophie had remained in Louisiana, married and had children, but the family had scattered during the early 20th century's Great Migration north. Some researchers believe they located Sophie's great-granddaughter in Detroit in the 1970s, but the connection was never definitively proven. Clara, the woman whose suffering was so visible to Amelia, left no descendants. She died of pneumonia in 1862, still enslaved, still carrying the trauma of what had been done to her. Her name appears in Amelia's diary 47 times, always with notations about her condition, her silence, her hollowed-out existence. She represents the countless victims whose stories were not preserved, whose suffering left no mark except in the memories of those who witnessed it. The story of Oakridge forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. It shows how evil can be rationalized through the language of science and progress. It demonstrates how systems of oppression operate not just through open violence, but through bureaucratic organization, careful documentation, and networks of cooperation among people who believed they were advancing human knowledge. It reveals the limited options available, even to privileged women, when they found themselves complicit in atrocity they had no legal power to stop. Amelia Whitaker was not a hero in any simple sense. She waited too long. She was complicit in suffering she documented, but did not immediately resist. She benefited from the same slave system that enabled Theodore's crimes. Her eventual resistance came only after she had witnessed unspeakable horrors and failed to prevent them. But she also preserved evidence that would otherwise have been destroyed. She risked her freedom and possibly her life to stop what she could stop. She used what limited power she possessed to save at least some children from trafficking, and she ensured that the truth would eventually be known, even if it took a century for that knowledge to emerge. The land where Oakridge stood is now divided among several small farms and a section of Amite National Forest. Hikers occasionally stumble across the old cemetery, though the markers are mostly illegible now, covered in lichen and cracked by a century and a half of weather. The stone foundation of the main house is still visible if you know where to look, slowly being consumed by kudzu and Virginia creeper. There is no historical marker noting what happened here, no memorial to the women who were violated, the children who were stolen, the lives destroyed by Theodore's experiments and Amelia's delayed intervention. The place itself has been forgotten by everyone except a handful of specialists who study the darkest corners of slavery's history, but the documents remain, carefully preserved now in the University of Louisiana's Special Collections Library. Researchers still come to study them, still grapple with what they reveal about the capacity for human cruelty and the complicity of those who witness evil but fail to stop it immediately. Students read excerpts in history classes, confronting the reality that the past was worse than they imagined, that the crimes of slavery extended far beyond what textbooks typically acknowledge. And Jacob's story, Violet's story, Lila's story, and Amelia's story continue to be told, imperfect and disturbing as they are, because forgetting would be worse than remembering. The truth, no matter how painful, serves as a warning about what happens when power is unchecked, when human beings are treated as property, when science is perverted to justify atrocity. This is the story of Oakridge Plantation. Not a ghost story or a tale of supernatural horror, but something far more terrifying. A true account of what human beings are capable of doing to one another, when law and custom permit it, when economic incentives reward it, when pseudoscience rationalizes. The real horror is not that such things happened in some distant, unimaginable past. The real horror is that they happened within the lifetimes of people whose grandchildren are still alive today. The real horror is how easy it is to forget, to minimize, to look away from evidence that makes us uncomfortable. What do you think of this story? Could Amelia have done more? Should we judge historical figures by the standards of their time or by universal moral principles? How do we reckon with the fact that many people benefited from systems they knew were wrong but felt powerless to change? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must continue to ask. If this investigation into America's hidden history affected you, subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the past's darkest corners. Share this video with others who want to understand the truth about slavery beyond what textbooks teach. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and your perspectives add to our collective understanding of these difficult histories. These stories are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Only by confronting what really happened can we ensure it never happens again. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next investigation into the mysteries and horrors of American history.